that these islands have a new saint, it's time to set aside the dismal news about the promotion of anti-life, anti-family measures by the British government in Northern Ireland and by the UN worldwide. John Henry Newman was received into the church only after he'd satisfied himself that the infallibility that she claims for the popes was not a personal infallibility, but rather a personal exercise of the church's own infallibility. Therefore, it was not and is not possible for any off-message pope, such as the pope who signed the Arian-leaning Second Declaration of Sirmium, to undermine the faith or command the church to lurch in some novel direction. As St. Vincent of Lerins wrote in his Commonitorium from his agreeable island in the Bay of Cannes 1500 years ago, it's not permissible to add anything to the faith, or to take anything away from the faith, or to change any of the faith. The job of popes and of theologians is to follow the first theologian, our Blessed Lady, and ponder the faith in their hearts so as to understand it better. Newman's conversion to Rome was a big deal. The hierarchy had recently been restored in Britain after centuries of absence, and new Catholic churches were being built all over the place. Those who had been closet Catholics could now come safely out of the woodwork and began to do so. The Anglican ecclesiastical establishment was nervous about this and was furious when Newman convinced himself, after the most rigorous intellectual inquiry, that the Church of Peter was indeed the one true church, with the Lord of life at its head and us as its members. Newman was viciously attacked and vigorously responded to his critics, sometimes directing whole books at them. He took no prisoners. He was ruthlessly clear in what he wrote, and the sheer clarity of his understanding blazingly pierced the amiable fog of calculated uncertainty that is at once the most charming and the most unfortunate aspect of Anglicanism. His books could not have been more timely today. The idea of a university, for instance, is sorely needed at a time when the communization of the senior common rooms throughout the groves of Western academia is gravely imperiling freedom of speech, of expression, of research, of inquiry, and of publication in a growing range of subjects. This week, revolting students at Newman's University, Oxford, voted to ban applause throughout the university for reasons that are far from clear. Now, applause is one of the most endearing and enduring forms of human expression. If one hears a well-turned speech or a harmonious musical performance or a good play, one wants to applaud it. But the new Puritans of the far left now wish to deny to their fellow men even this most harmless, most charitable, most warm-hearted medium of expression. Of course, the academic comrades who ought to have put a stop to any such nonsense are showing every sign of merely deferring to it, for it's one more depressing step in the process of bankrupting the intellectual West, a process to which many professors and doctors of learning, so-called, have sedulously devoted the whole of their useless careers. Newman would have had no truck with any such nonsense. He might even have directed a book at the pseudo-pietism of those who will ban applause and yet will promote abortion, for there is a noticeably large overlap between those two groups. For us, though, who are Catholics, the canonization of Newman is an excellent opportunity to consider what saints are for, why they matter, and why they rock. In most of the Protestant presentations of Christianity, sainthood is regarded, at best, with intense suspicion. The more extreme anti-Catholics tend to say there's no such thing as a saint at all, because none of us is perfect. And yet these are the very same people who say there's no such thing as original sin, in which case, of course, we're all saints. In the Catholic tradition, however, sainthood is regarded in a much more pragmatic light. We start by believing that there is such a thing as original sin. Indeed, it's perhaps the most readily comprehensible and observable of all the Catholic doctrines. To see its consequences, simply look about you. Therefore, apart from the Lord of life and his Blessed Mother, none of us is free from the taint of original sin. In the inimitable words of Dr. Heinz Kiosk in the famous Daily Telegraph Peter Simple column of 30 years ago, we are all guilty. Where then is the scope for sainthood? The answer lies in the triumphant overcoming of the disabilities caused by original sin. Overcoming those disabilities by the long and determined efforts of the saint to do that which is right and just and good. And there are far more saints around you and me than you or I will ever be able to count. One of my many amiable hobbies is looking out for them. I collect saints. The first example is my lovely wife. Proof of her sainthood is easy to provide. She has put up with me for almost 30 years. Indeed, instead of growing to hate me for my many inadequacies, a constitutional incapability when it comes to washing up is just one of these, she has somehow magically grown to love me and forgive me more and more as time has passed. For my part, I have nothing to forgive, for my lovely wife is, in my unprejudiced and dispassionate eyes, the very image and exemplar of a saint. Let me give you one further example. My doctor and good friend of 45 years, Dr. David O'Connell, trained in Dublin and practicing in London, has recently died. He was younger than me. He too was a saint, and a most remarkable one. He had an astonishing gift for diagnosis. I once walked into his surgery in a fashionable and modest corner of Chelsea, and he leapt to his feet, came rushing out from behind his desk, and shook me warmly by the hand. He said, "I never thought I'd meet anyone with the condition from which you are now visibly suffering. You have a disease so rare that only one person in 10 million gets it." Yet none of the costly specialists I'd been to see had noticed that I had this disease. David, however, a mere general practitioner, as he used to call himself, had spotted it instantly, where the specialists had expensively and repeatedly failed. Then David had to convince those very same specialists that he was right and they were wrong. Ingeniously, he did so by suggesting that I had a disease he knew I didn't have. They rushed me into hospital to prove that I didn't have that disease, and while I was there, I told them the specialists had asked for an additional test to be carried out. That additional test showed beyond doubt that David's diagnosis had been correct. The eminent professor, the specialist who had previously dismissed any such diagnosis, agreed to see me, and then he said that David, a mere GP, had of course made a catastrophic misdiagnosis in having diagnosed the disease which he knew I didn't have. But, he said, that I indeed did have another disease, and that though the professor didn't know it, that was the disease that David had diagnosed just by taking one look at me. Thus David saved my life, and by no means for the first time. I used to take people to see him who could never normally have afforded his monstrous fees. He always used to see them either at half price or, more often than not, at no charge at all. Time and time again, he found out what was wrong when all others, including the eminent specialists, had entirely failed. And I watched as people who had been dragged in to see him because they thought nobody could do them any good, came out grinning from ear to ear after just half an hour's consultation, realizing that he had indeed found out exactly what was wrong with them and that he was going to be able to put them right. David himself remained unfailingly cheerful to the end, spending every one of his holidays for 50 years in Lourdes looking after our Lord's the sick. He was a great man and a great saint, and since there is justice in heaven, he will now be merry there, along with Cardinal Newman and all the many other saints recognised and unrecognised, who have walked the earth and have adorned the church and inspired those of us who are merely struggling sinners. God bless you all. Thank you for watching. I shall be here every week with further thoughts of interest to members of the one true, original, beware of all imitations, Catholic and Apostolic Church. God bless you.